Okay, the possible divergence is now complete on the intraday charts, the 4-hour charts, the 60-minute charts. We might see a peak with that ahead of Powell or surrounding Powell to complete those divergences. Powell's going to make a speech tomorrow at Jackson Hole, Friday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Powell will give his speech at Jackson Hole. We'll be watching to see what happens. We did get some interesting signals today showing weakness. Now quickly, again, I told you to be watching for candlestick reversal patterns to show up. We got a gap and trap in the intraday time frame, and that has set up the bearish engulfing here on the NASDAQ. We got a bearish engulfing on the S&P 500. Possible reversal bars. We gapped higher, but then we closed lower, completely engulfing the bearish, bar from the previous day. Possible bearish reversal. The candlestick has to be confirmed and get a follow through. And again, I told you that is what I think is going on with NASDAQ, is I think we're eventually going up to fill this gap, but I think you're going to have this in all likelihood where we sell off, we come back up, and then we hit it, so you get a bigger sell off, but then still come back up and reach that level. But I think that the NASDAQ has a good shot at having a peak, hitting major trend lines of resistance when this rising wedge formed, and we're forming divergences on indicators. Bearish engulfing on NASDAQ, a bearish engulfing on the S&P 500. We'll see if we get the confirmation with Powell or on into next week. If they are not confirmed, the candlesticks are meaningless. Again, candlesticks have to be confirmed. S&P did the same thing. It gapped higher, and then it turned and it closed below the previous day's low, and again wiped out a couple of days of gains there. You got a bearish engulfing candlestick. Again, we have this gap fill on an intraday basis. The close is up here. When the gap happened, the close is up there. Watching to see if we attempt to get that, or the reversal now begins. It will if we get confirmation and a follow through in the daily time frame. The 10 got above the 20. Now the 10 is getting above the 50. But again, remember, the moving averages are still in a bearish arrangement. In a bearish arrangement, the NASDAQ as well. Now we did get up the 10 back above the 50. We're watching this bearish engulfing candlestick on the S&P very closely, because again, it is not moving to a new high. It's not filling the gap yet. The gap fill is way up here. Well, not way up here. We're just above where we're at now. But it filled the gap on an intraday basis and got a bearish engulfing candlestick. So I'm going to be watching what becomes of the bearish engulfing. I told you to be watching for a reversal candle pattern if prices are to reverse. And I've talked about the S&P eventually moving to new highs. I still think that's likely going to be the case. NASDAQ making a lower high and diverging with it. Talked about that quite a bit. So again, listen, candlesticks have to be confirmed. We got a bearish engulfing today, but it has to get confirmation below the low of the wick there, and then a follow through. We don't have that yet, and so we'll be watching to see if we get it, if we get confirmation of a fall through. And if we do see this follow through and reversal, then again the candle will be validated. A bearish engulfing here on the S&P. You got a bearish engulfing on the NASDAQ. We'll be watching to see if we attempt a rebound. Now, I told you that divergences were forming with the 4-hour charts of futures. Told you the other day we might get more green bars followed by red that could complete the divergence. Earlier in the week, we saw that happen on Tuesday, and again, it only led to a sideways corrective move. I talked about that, and I told you we could still, even with this divergence that was forming here, we could still see a multiple point divergence develop here, which is what ended up happening. To play out, we got to get confirmation of the bearish engulfing candlestick in the next day or two. I told you we could get that RSI on the 60-minute chart, forming the divergence. We ended up seeing that happen, and now again have a completed divergence with a multiple point divergence here with the awesome oscillator We had the divergence already with the MACD. We might try to get a triple divergence or just to recovery and have it fail. But we've had these divergences. We've had the completion now of a multiple point divergence here. So we'll be watching to see what happens Friday. Rebound with Powell and then sell off, tweak, or a rebound, end up selling off with Powell, watching how it unfolds very closely. Today we got a bearish signal here. This is the S&P 500 E-mini futures. And again, turning back to red. Now it turned back to red here, but we only corrected sideways to form this last divergence. Be watching to see what happens with this one. Same thing is true for the NASDAQ 100 futures in the 4-hour time frame. Same thing. You got the bearish signal today. You corrected sideways with this previous divergence. Now you have a multiple point divergence. Again, I think the NASDAQ is going to go back and correct and move higher. I've talked about that on the NASDAQ scenario. I still think that's going to be the case. Now look, the NASDAQ's got this bearish engulfing along with the S&P. It's come up to just under its 78.6 Fibonacci. I'll be watching to see if the bearish engulfing is confirmed. We're moving back, testing the 50. The 10 and 20 are still below the 50-period moving average. And got back above the 20, and again, we got back above the 20 with that momentum shift. But again, eventually I think we are going to come back up and fill the gap here at 20,004 or 20,398. If we round up, it's 20,400. Again, I think you could come down, get a sell off, and then eventually move back up there as we move towards a Fed pivot. But then I think you're going to get a lower high and even more selling. But I do think you've got a good shot at a sell off here with some of the divergences that are forming on the 60-minute charts and the 4-hour charts. So I'll be watching, do we get confirmation to the candlestick? Do we get a follow through? And do we take out the 50 and stay below it? If so, we'll be watching to see some of the gaps fill on NASDAQ and the S&P that I've been talking about. It's a scenario that I think is going to happen for the NASDAQ. I'm warning you about this trend line right here with our log scaling on the S&P, and we've reversed off of it. NASDAQ's reversing 78.6 Fibonacci just under it, with bearish divergences on those 60-minute charts. Again, you're turning off this trend line. Again, we were told this wasn't going to happen. Again, S&P still go up and make new highs here. Will divergences play out, we might see a correction or pullback first. Now, I told you that if we got the divergences completing there on the 4-hour chart, we might see the start of a reversal. That only gave us a sideways move on NASDAQ cash and S&P cash. But today we got a gap and trap. We gapped higher and then we sold off for the rest of the session. We'll be watching to see if we get a rebound with Powell. Again, it could be just probably for a lower high if we're now breaking down of this rising wedge and completing our divergence. I told you to be watching for this divergence to complete. We did it earlier. A topping tail, rally back up, and then we got a little bit more weakness here with the 4-hour bars, but then gapped higher on Thursday and then turned back down. You can see it right here to the 50-period moving average. If we end up, so the diversion is now complete. We'll be watching to see what happens here. We'll see if we try to bounce with Powell on the 50-period moving average, but you are breaking the trend line here. You are taking out the momentum line and the momentum cloud. I told you that needed to happen. It's now happening. Here on the NASDAQ 60-minute chart, we do have all these other gaps. And again, I do think, again, we could bounce or just continue to break. But I think if you bounce and you come back down, I think you could come back and fill some of these gaps or maybe all of them. Still rebound back up and fill the gap way up here, 20,400. Our divergence is now complete on the 60-minute chart. I told you to be watching for this as we hit those extremes previously. Now it is complete. We saw momentum shift. We had a divergence here, and then we got another one here, and again with prices correcting sideways. But that's now played out. So again, we'll be watching the NASDAQ 50-period moving average. Same thing going on with the S&P. Again, I talked about that divergence completing. We corrected sideways, but we're now taking out the momentum line. I told you, again, to be watching for the momentum line and the momentum cloud to be taken out. We're just above the 50 period. We'll see if we try to bounce with Powell. Bigger sell-off. I'll be watching these gaps here on the 60-minute chart of the S&P 500. We're getting those negative divergences as S&P is backtesting the trend line. Could eventually cause pring parameter to roll over here. We'll be watching to see if we try to bounce off the 50 with Powell's speech, or if we break it, do we rally up with Powell and get a lower high? Actually, these divergences are going to give us a pullback or reversal on the 60-minute chart. You see the same divergence had formed on the MACD, and again, it didn't turn up. We rallied back up. I talked about this trend line right here, which was my original trend line, and it being in possible backtest mode. We originally that trend line and came down. We went sideways, and then today we backtested. We had a gap and trap, and we rallied right up into the trend line, and we completed this negative divergence, which has led to the sell-off. We'll be watching to see if we rally with Powell off the 50 period or try to break it. You got a candle of indecision at the last bar of trading. Eventually, again, S&P could come back and try to fill these gaps, but I've also talked about the possibility that we try to get a 5-leg push higher right here, right now, where you got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then or pardon me, 3, this whole thing right here, then 4 right now, and then that gives us 5 later on if we don't get a much bigger decline. So I'll be watching to see how it unfolds here. But the back test of the trend line is what I'm talking about right here. I've been talking about that possibility. The gap higher back tested this trend line, the breakdown and back test of this rising wedge here on the NASDAQ 100. I found that pretty interesting. Again, breaking the momentum line, momentum cloud. If we rally back up again, you got a pretty good shot of a lower high now with these divergences in place. Told you I was looking for the momentum line to shift on the 4-hour chart of the S&P 500. It did that today with the sell-off, and then here getting confirmation in the 4-hour time frame. Again, we could still try to rally back up with Powell initially, but I'll be watching to see if the trend starts to change here. Again, here we saw the momentum shift, and then with that came the shift with the trend, and it led to the sell-off. I'll continue to talk about these intraday charts, and again, intraday charts show short-term fluctuations. I wanted to talk about that because, again, we continue to get these big moves up, big move down, big move back up. NASDAQ and S&P are probably going to get another sell-off. If NASDAQ gets a big move down, larger ABC can form, and again, I still think S&P is likely going to make a new high, but so I'll be watching that. But wanted to show you this here on the S&P 500 momentum trying to turn. We're getting that bearish reversal of conditions on the futures 4-hour chart today, and showing you that in this video, and S&P reaching extremes up here. And again, we've seen momentum turn back up, but we are reaching extremes just under that gap fill, now getting a bearish engulfing. So we'll be watching to see if we get a pullback without moving to a new high. The S&P 500, and again, NASDAQ nowhere near the highs. The same candlestick of bearish engulfing. VIX was up 7.62% today. The VIX had broken out of a bullish falling wedge. It got back above the 50 period yesterday. The Doji, we're back holding above it today, and today we closed above the 10 period moving average. The 50 remains above the 200. We could see the VIX go back up. If a volatility increase, we'll get a bigger sell-off in the market, bigger than what we already have. So again, the VIX has been inching higher, back above the 50. Here also, momentum flipping today. So we have the momentum line flipping today. Here we went flatlined and we flipped back to red. We'll be watching to see if we eventually see trend signals begin to turn on these intraday charts.